Alzheimer's disease is a very slowly progressive, degenerative disease of the brain. Cells degenerate, dysfunction, and eventually die. This is a disease that affects principally the higher centers of the brain, the cerebral cortex and the hippocampus, areas involved in learning, memory, and higher intellectual functioning. The lower levels of brain activity, as we think of it in evolutionary terms, emotion, motor systems, reactions, are well preserved. In the more advanced stages, as the disease progresses, they lose the ability to recognize their loved ones, their own children, for example. They recognize the face as familiar, but they can't put a name to their child or even their spouse of 50 years. In the final stages of the disease, virtually all higher brain functioning is lost. So patients typically are mute, unresponsive to anything other than pain.
Two and a half years ago, Willem DeKooning, the last surviving giant of abstract expressionist painting, was diagnosed to be suffering from Alzheimer's disease. As the result of a court deposition filed by his daughter Lisa, DeKooning was declared legally incompetent. But according to the lawyers who now look after the artist's finances, DeKooning continues to paint masterfully. The affair provoked an Artworld scandal earlier this year, fueled by the knowledge that DeKooning's collection of his own paintings, many of them executed during a period when his memory was known to be lost, has an estimated value of some $300 million. These are photographs of some of those recent paintings, shown here for the first time. Are they merely the mechanical, reflexive actions of a once great technical master, or are they, as some critics claim, a late, great, transcendent flowering of creativity? If they are that, where does that leave our ideas about the nature of creativity and the way we judge the value of abstract art?
It's quite conceivable to me that he is somewhat in the same position as Van Gogh, that he can work despite the handicap, as severe as it might be, because of this innate genius that he has, which is a gift that is very rare.
Van Eyck could not have produced his paintings suffering from Alzheimer's. Mondrian could not have produced his painting suffering from Alzheimer's. It's only a particular kind of painting, a painting in which the formative impulses, the intellectual impulses in painting are under suspension, and the sheer, unfettered elements of the personality are allowed to flow without being governed by any kind of intellectual discipline.
It seems very nice that they could provide them with paint and canvas, sit them down and let them play with paint. But when they say masterpieces, bullshit.
This is an unexpected contemporary art story. Words like masterful or genius are so overused now, we rarely take them at face value. But if they have any meaning at all, it should be found in the story of DeKooning, widely considered the world's greatest living painter.
came in August, 7 o'clock in the morning. And I saw all those skyscrapers, you know, in the mist, and it was quite a sight, yeah. And I immediately felt comfortable, yeah.
Willem DeKooning arrived in America as an illegal alien in August 1926. He was 21 and had stowed away on a steamer. Born in Rotterdam, DeKooning had been apprenticed to a commercial art and decorating firm and had spent 8 years studying drawing and painting at evening classes at the Rotterdam Academy of Art. His expertise at academic techniques, this still life study was executed when he was only 12, was backed up by a knowledge of contemporary avant-garde art. DeKooning's attraction to America was a fascination with the romantic vision of America's popular culture, of Hollywood movies rather than high art. He spent his first years in New York earning his living as a commercial artist, doing his own paintings at the weekends. Indebted to contemporary European styles, to the work of Matisse, Picasso, Miro and Mondrian, DeKooning's paintings of the 20s and 30s were experiments in abstraction and a highly stylized, anatomically dislocated figuration. During the Depression years, DeKooning was able to work as a full-time artist through the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, a government scheme to provide work for artists who were commissioned to paint public murals. On the WPA, he first met the artists who, with DeKooning, were to become known as the abstract expressionists. This circle was to be the springboard for DeKooning's public career, and a reference point by which everything he later produced was judged. To begin with, it was a talking group with regular weekly meetings.
It seems hard to imagine now, but people needed and wanted very intensely to talk to one another. And they talked about what was happening in their paintings. And one thing I think that made that more important is that there was an insecurity about whether abstraction at all was really viable. People were very anxious about that.
The artists were isolated and felt themselves to be in a provincial position, working out of what they saw as the most advanced European art, but cut off from the roots of the European tradition. The search for a new style, one that was meaningful to their own situation, was seen as inextricably tied to the problem of content.
Content is a glimpse of something, an encounter like a flash. It's very tiny content. And then in the end, if I have a picture, I give somebody else something of that glimpse.
DeKooning's first exhibition in 1948, when he was already in his mid-40s, was of black and white paintings of improvised shapes compressed into a shallow abstract space. They were hailed as a triumph by abstract expressionism's most influential supporter, critic Clement Greenberg.
We visited Bill's studio, and there was Winter 48 on the easel, and it looked so damn good. Bill was by way of being a genius as a draftsman. Yeah. Mastery, okay, let's leave out, genius is enough.
As the movement gained recognition and individual artists, especially Jackson Pollock with his famous spread in Life magazine, became known to a wider public, so the myth of abstract expressionism began to inflate, centered on the image of Pollock and the idea of artistic creation as a kind of self-creation. Abstract expressionism was now discussed less in terms of aesthetics than as a heroic moral struggle. The intellectual commonplaces of the 50s, existentialism, the void, the role of the unconscious in creativity, became the new buzzwords of art talk.
You must understand that New York also is probably more psychoanalytically oriented than any other city. When we came across the surrealist principle of what they called automatism, of automatic painting, which is a free association of beginning with splatters or with doodles and slowly converting it into an image without ideas of how it ought to turn about.
At the height of the excitement over abstract expressionism in the early 50s, DeKooning shocked the movement's rapidly expanding audience by his reintroduction of what was now regarded as a forbidden subject, the human figure.
And I noticed that when I had something, a photographic image like this, the mouth, it gave me a point of reference. It was something to hold on to. Goddesses, that grin they have, they really scared the pants of me. It also was like some kind of glimpse, like meeting one of those ladies.
The agitated slashings and gestures of the women's series, enlarged in later paintings of the 50s into compositions suggestive of urban landscapes, became known as DeKooning's signature style, abstract but quintessentially recognizable.
DeKooning's paintings read like a catalogue of everything that paint can be made to do. It's dragged, scraped, pressed, spattered, dripped. It all fits, but at the same time it's discontinuous. Close to a DeKooning surface is all halts and breaks and changing courses. It's all action and gesture and no planning. Or apparently, then you step back and it all seems to come together. For the other abstract expressionists, the drive was towards simplification and emptying out, spreading out a simple image over a large surface. For DeKooning, whether the picture is large or small, it's all congestion. It's all very complicated. Every shape is made of traces of previous layers of painting, previous times. There are shadows and illusions of things in front of other things that seem to break down and reform as you look. The artist's hand making and erasing and remaking. That's what makes a DeKooning.
We seem to get personal, spontaneous gestures in DeKooning. Personal in the sense that they have a certain kind of energy that is particular to the paintings they appear in and that we don't see in other artists, okay? And we're dealing with energy, we're dealing with tempo, we're dealing with rhythm. There is the sense of nothing held back, the sense of an energy, so to say, synergistically multiplying itself, unfolding with great rapidity and intensity. And all of that is something we would associate with creativity in the most primordial sense.
It was never just intuition going on there. There was knowledge always, and a certain kind of control with something pulling and pushing against it. And I think that made it fascinating.
It was to see an artist in total command, intellectually as well as emotionally, of his medium. He had the technical gifts, the technical command, he had the stylistic elegance, he had the overall expressive power to do something that hadn't been done before, and yet that almost instantly seemed to take his place in a certain line of succession from the great painters who preceded him.
With the early death of Jackson Pollock in a car crash in 1956, de Kooning became the American art world's most glamorous figure.
De Kooning was then the, to use Pauline Kael's expression, the main man. I mean, he was considered the Marlon Brando of abstract expressionist painting.
He was beautiful and loved. He had immense charm. Everybody adored him. He had disciples galore. I mean, Pollock never had any disciples. Motherwell never had any disciples. De Kooning had disciples. He had younger artists, all of whom wanted to be little de Koonings, and they were.
He looked cute. He was small, he was good looking, he was smiley. He made people feel that he's listening. He didn't give a shit, though. He was very calculating.
Bill, I'm being so cruel now. Always had a big studio, so he could back off from his painting. Passed by, I saw him standing against the window, looking at the painting that was at least 10, 15 yards away. And I thought, oh, again, he's looking at what can, I've got to I got to get this painting in shape so to bear out the fact that I'm the best painter of the 20th century.
He was not averse to saying, I'm the greatest artist when he was drunk. And sometimes he would beat his chest when he was very drunk and say, I'm the greatest artist in the world.
Under the combined pressure of his sudden stardom and the breakup of his 20-year marriage to the painter Elaine de Kooning gradually moved his base to the leafy countryside of East Hampton, an hour's drive from New York.
Now I'm very much influenced by the water here. I try to get the light of this water. I mean, this, or the light here. And it helped me enormously getting hold of a tone, the light of a painting.
Over the next 2 decades, the influence of the new environment made itself felt in de Kooning's painting in a new openness of colour and atmosphere and a loosening up of the structure. The old subjects returned, but now the figures were desperate or hilarious caricatures, the landscapes melting and ambiguous. The change in mood left many of de Kooning's former supporters cold. De Kooning was physically cut off from the New York art world, but also isolated in other ways. The abstract expressionist circle had already broken up in the early 50s, Now its myths and rhetoric were being challenged by a new wave of art. Pop art, minimalism and conceptualism, and the new hard-edge abstraction now championed by Greenberg. De Kooning was a giant of the museum world, but although a respected figure, he was no longer talked about by artists.
Bill just didn't have anything more to say. And you say, well, what does the painter have to say? Well, I say, what does the composer have to say? Okay, so Bill wasn't charged anymore. And why? Because he had a deficient character. I'll come out flat and he'd say that.
But the talk of de Kooning's art falling off in quality was now matched by stories of his alcoholism and failing mental powers. In the past, heroic drinking bouts and brawling in famous downtown art hangouts like the Cedar Street Tavern, where Jackson Pollock was said to have once made an entrance by ripping the door off its hinges, had been an integral part of the abstract expressionist myth. But now de Kooning's history of drinking was seen in a new light, as a sign of a deeply self-destructive streak.
The drinking did him in.
What about this drinking? What type of drinker was he?
A drunk.
DeKooning was a brawler in the village during the 50s and 60s, and really the persona that was most talked about was the DeKooning who drank too much and went to the bar and tried to haul off and hit Clement Greenberg.
He first started saying that de Kooning's best paintings were in the early 50s. Then he said, no, they were early in the late 40s. Then another time he said, no, his best work was about 1945. Then he decided the early 40s was really de Kooning's best work. And then I think at the point when he said de Kooning's best work was in the late 30s, I think that was the time that it really came to blows.
Well, de Kooning putting his elbow in my face and then getting up and hit me when I was up. I thought, yeah, that's stinky de Kooning, yeah.
There's something about drinking to excess that resembles a suicidal inclination to me. But these are very, very complicated questions, and so it became part of Bill's life for some years. He probably had 20, 25 years of benders.
But if de Kooning's hold on reality was faltering, other forces ensured that de Kooning's myths stayed in sharp focus. Whatever came out of the studio, of whatever quality, was of equal value to the culture industry that had now grown up around the art world. The void left by the loss of serious appreciation and discussion of his work was now filled by hagiography, a stream of official honors, including presidential medals, and a new status as an emblem of official American culture.
He was drinking so heavily around 1979 that maybe he was facing death.
Shocked by the state of his health, Elaine de Kooning, herself a former alcoholic, moved back in with de Kooning to look after him. She brought her brother Conrad Fried to work closely with de Kooning as a daily companion and studio assistant. Together they got him off alcohol and the tranquilizers, to which he was also addicted, and back to painting. Fried began to record de Kooning's new daily routine on film.
It might start at 2 or 3 in the morning with the lights suddenly going on in the studio, and Bill, who wore pajamas, be down there in his slippers, deciding to either look at the painting or to do a little painting. I got him onto cocoa at night or decaffeinated coffee. He might work at 10 in the morning, noon, 2 in the afternoon, 4, whenever. Mostly painted every day.
De Kooning's recovery heralded another stylistic change. The paintings of the early 80s were light, linear, spare, seemingly effortless. They were without any of the signs of struggle and revision that were the hallmarks of all de Kooning's previous phases. The work received a mixed response from critics, but serious discussion about their worth was overridden by the automatic appreciation of the market. In the 1980s, the art market, dominated by the big auction houses, worked increasingly like the stock exchange, and the most blue-chip name of all, the name that guaranteed sales in the millions rather than the hundreds of thousands of dollars, was de Kooning.
In '83, he was the first artist to break $1 million with his two women. In '84, there was a work on paper laid down on canvas, which fetched $1.9 million. In '87, we have Pink Lady, which fetched $3.6 million. These paintings of the '80s had moved in the same direction as the market for his earlier work. We sold a painting in 1987, and it was the standard de Kooning size, 80 by 70 inches, or 70 by 80 inches. That we sold that for $350,000. This was a painting from the estate of Xavier Fourcade. And then 3 years later, in 1990, there was one sold for $3.5 million, same size and painted a year later.
De Kooning's dealer, Xavier Fourcade, died in 1987, and from that point, new paintings by de Kooning stopped appearing on the market. Nothing further was to be released from the studio. De Kooning continued to paint in a protected and sympathetic environment. But then, in February 1989, the routine was broken when Elaine de Kooning died of cancer. De Kooning, now in his mid-80s, his support system suddenly withdrawn, was left alone and vulnerable.
I had been appointed by Judge Meade as the guardian for Mr. de Kooning. I tried to engage Mr. de Kooning in conversations. I asked him about Sidney Janis, who was somebody he'd had a falling out with. I asked him other types of questions. I would get basically a guttural response that meant nothing to me.
Pierre Lundberg was ordered to investigate de Kooning's competence when Lisa de Kooning, the artist's illegitimate daughter, filed a petition to the East Hampton court, seeking control of her father's estate on the grounds that he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease and was incapable of handling his own affairs.
The most conversation if you want to call it a conversation, I had with him was when I finally handed him a copy of the petition. And he took the petition and he read this caption aloud, word for word, made no errors whatsoever. Then he took the document and he flipped through the rest of it. But he was uninterested in it and put it down. That was about the extent of my conversations with Mr. de Kooning.
He, little by little, stopped recognizing people or acknowledging them and talking in non sequiturs, and something was slipping away.
When I walked in there, he was sitting in his favorite high chair, looking at his work as if he never stopped painting, looking exactly that he did years ago, and he was just sitting like that. But his eyes were downcast. He was looking down like that, and I didn't say a word. I talked to him, and he didn't reply. He didn't reply to anybody, even his own daughter. But he didn't look sad. He just looked like he was out of it.
De Kooning's illness became an Artworld scandal in the summer of 1989, when an open letter, co-signed by a group of his oldest friends, was published in an East Hampton paper. The letter presented a pathetic image of bleak isolation, alleging that de Kooning was kept a virtual prisoner in his own home, surrounded by paid nurses and lawyers, and denied access to his friends.
I don't know why they put him in a cocoon and kept people out. His friends, who understood that he was ill, they would simply ignore it and treat him as if he was all right. And I think something would come through.
They're lawyers. They're concerned with primarily, I think, money as an estate, you know, and that has nothing to do with our relationship with Bill or, you know, has nothing to do with him.
They're thinking of how much of his painting could be put out on the market without hurting the prices and so on. Things like that. We never think of such things, you know.
Later that summer, the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease was reconfirmed and Lisa won control of her father's estate. Then in November, an event occurred that was to transform its value.
A new price record has been set for the sale of a painting by a living artist. Interchange, a painting by the abstract expressionist Willem DeKooning, was sold last night for $20.7 million.
As a result of the sale, DeKooning's estate, consisting of several hundred unsold and largely unseen recent works by the artist, was now reckoned to have increased in value from an estimated $50 million to $300 million. And DeKooning was producing more works every day. The lawyers had issued a statement that although ill, he continued to paint masterfully.
I was very lucky to be in the studio two and a half years ago. And he was there, he was painting when I was in the studio. And I saw a couple of paintings in the studio that were just breathtaking. I mean, absolutely. I mean, if I could have just run out the door with them, I would have. I mean, they were quite strong and in some ways surprising from work that I'd seen, you know, in the early to mid-'80s.
At about the same time Larry Gagosian was at the studio, DeKooning's friend, the painter Herman Cherry, had also visited the artist and had taken photographs of what he found there. These pictures suggest an extraordinary possibility that even as his condition worsened, DeKooning was developing, even strengthening his art. If anything, the paintings seem richer and livelier than much of the work of the early 80s. Instead of the earlier paintings' spare palette of primary colours and white, the new paintings show a wide range of colours and use of strong black outline. The shapes are more varied and suggestive, even playful, the impact stronger.
Obviously, the two principal skills necessary to paint are the motor skills to wield the brush, set up the canvas, whatever. The second skill that's obvious is vision, to be able to see what you're painting. Both of those skills are well preserved in Alzheimer's disease. The visual system and the motor system are not much affected, at least until the very late stages of the disease. So those two necessary skills are preserved. Now, I don't think I understand at all what comes between the eyes and the hand of the painter.
What may be preserved in DeKooning are certain things which are very highly practiced, things he did over and over, maybe in many different contexts, and possibly for a long time. And that fits in very well with an idea that psychologists call overlearning.
One could construct a canvas almost on emotion, taking one color, adding it to the canvas, taking a second color, adding another shape to the canvas, and really being governed by the immediate feed in, the information that's coming in. It looks good, let's continue. It doesn't look good, let's change this. There again, I think probably after a lifetime of painting, there's also some deeply ingrained memories.
If DeKooning's illness went back several years, it meant that paintings that had fetched high prices on the market had been made with a minimum of reasoning or willpower or intellectual judgment. Ideas about DeKooning that had been voguish in the 1950s, of automatism, of the painted image being generated from raw emotion, were now unexpectedly re-invoked.
What we have in de Kooning is a sense, no doubt an illusion in part, of the moment of creativity, as it were, the moment of origination, as it were. In a sense, if you go back to Michelangelo's famous image of God reaching his hand out to Adam as though to breathe life into him, or at least to breathe consciousness into him, that's the creative moment. That's the moment when Adam truly comes into being. And it's as though de Kooning is dealing in his gestures, particularly in the early work, with that same kind of touch, that finger that will bring a body and a mind and a spirit to life.
If de Kooning is all about the essence of creation, what does that say about these new paintings, which surely are nothing but that pure moment of creativity?
When I started looking at these paintings, of course I knew that de Kooning had this terrible disease. But after a couple of minutes, I'd forgotten about that. Just as when one listens to Beethoven's late works, one knows at the back of one's mind that this man was deaf and in a terrible state. But one forgets it in seconds. And that was the feeling I had with these paintings. I think they're wonderful paintings.
What de Kooning has to have, pre-Alzheimer de Kooning has to have to be creative, is the intention to do something in a new and different way, and the ability to carry out his intentions. Now, that's what we may not be seeing in the old Alzheimer de Kooning.
De Kooning doesn't know what he painted yesterday. If you were to show him woman number 1, he would say, who did this? What is this? He doesn't know he's an artist. He doesn't think of himself as an anything, because he has no memory for the past. And he probably has no memory for the distant past now either, which tends to get lost later. So without the cognition, without the intellectual faculties and competencies and complex processes, and without a sense of self and an identity of self and who you are, you can't produce creative work.
I'm not convinced necessarily that Alzheimer's can affect de Kooning's ability to paint. It might impact upon it somehow, and it's possible that the paintings may not be as intellectually as astute, but I don't think painters are necessarily great intellectuals anyhow. I think creativity and intellect are regarded, and rightly so, as separate facilities. And I think he's painting from his creative genius.
If you are somebody who believes in genius, it seems to me the moment to turn off that belief is when your genius has Alzheimer's, and just call it quits. I would think when you had Alzheimer's would be exactly the time you would do the least interesting pictures you could possibly do. I mean, it's in a way denigrating his earlier work to say that he can keep up at this level despite the fact that he has Alzheimer's later on.
Talent proposes, but the mind disposes. And it's precisely this activity of mind, the kind of control of bringing the painting to completion, to a final realization, that is really missing from these late paintings of de Kooning. I mean, you cannot regard this as automatism. This is more in the realm of an artist flying by instruments, so to speak.
On autopilot.
Automatic pilot.
Ironically, the debate over the state of de Kooning's mind when he made these paintings will be only a minor detail for the real makers of value.
As far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter. I think they're still important and good works. And, I think it's really interesting that this is an artist who for 5 decades has made a significant aesthetic contribution to his own body of work, let alone, you know, the post-war American market or the post-war American aesthetics generally.
If they are as extraordinary as I would believe them to be, of course we would be happy to acquire them. We don't have the means to, but we would be happy to.
The position de Kooning occupies today as what I would characterize as a brain-damaged artist has less to do with the quality of his art than with the fact that he is one of the few living survivors of the New York school. He goes on producing. Anything he produces has a market value. There are so many parties that have a vested interest in certifying that these are the paintings of a master.
Today, no one knows what goes on in de Kooning's studio outside of a small circle of people, whether he has finally given up the struggle or still continues to recreate himself on canvas.
People have said, well, he's continuing to paint in an important way, to paint as a master. What is meant by the idea of master is goodwill. Goodwill is certain compassion for the man that, you know, he's still working hard. And people may be recognizing that continuation of the habit of painting, a certain way of moving the brush, moving the hand, certain kinds of gestures recurring. They may be acknowledging that by saying he's still got mastery.
He looks at that canvas. We have to see him as a human being looking at his own work, at what he just did, and having some important semblance of self there. By self now, I mean a person striving, wanting to do certain things and not other things. He's disappointed if he is. He looks at the canvas and he doesn't see de Kooning there. He struggles to regain de Kooning. Now, some of that struggle is preserved on the canvas that is eventually presented to the world.
I'm in my element, and I'm a little bit out of this world. Then I'm in the real world. You know, I'm on the beam. Because when I'm falling, I'm doing all right. When I'm slipping, I say, hey, this is very interesting. It's when I'm standing upright what bothers me. I'm really slipping most of the time into that glimpse. I'm like a slipping glimpser.